Okay, so today we're really diving into something that's been in the news a lot lately, media bias. And to do that, we're taking a deep dive into this book, Manufacturing Consent, by Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky.
Yeah, this book, it came out quite a while ago, but it's one of those like really foundational texts in media studies, and it goes deep, like really deep into how the information, particularly the news that we consume, is shaped.
It's like they're giving us like those X-ray glasses or something to see through all the kind of like BS.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not like your sort of everyday, oh, that news is biased kind of thing.
Mm.
They get at something much more kind of subtle and I think insidious.
So less fake news and more like
Yeah.
how the system itself distorts things kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And they have this they use this thing called the propaganda model, which I'll admit sounds a little intense,
Yeah.
but it's really a framework for understanding how bias can be like baked into the news without us even knowing it.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So less about like fake news and more about kind of how the system itself can distort things.
Exactly, precisely. And they break this down into 5 filters.
5 filters. Okay, so 5 ways the news gets, I don't know, spun, I guess.
Mm.
Ready? What are they?
Yeah, so the first one is the structure of the media itself, and this gets into the size, the ownership, like think big media conglomerates.
Right, because even news is a business at the end of the day.
Yeah, exactly. And the need to make a profit, well, they argue that can really shape what gets covered and how it gets covered.
Can you give me an example of that? How does that like actually play out in the real world?
Yeah, so like one thing they point to is the increasing influence of investors.
Yeah.
Investors they want profits and they want them bigger and they want them faster.
Yeah.
And this can lead to things like cost cutting in newsrooms, which means fewer journalists, less in-depth reporting, and more reliance on kind of those sensationalized stories that grab eyeballs.
That grab attention and therefore, advertising dollars.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that actually leads us to the second filter, which is advertising.
Okay.
Think about it this way, like all those targeted ads that seem to follow you around online.
Yeah.
It turns out that same logic applies to the news as well.
Wait, so you're saying like news outlets cater to certain audiences to kind of please advertisers?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Advertisers, they want viewers, they want consumers, and specifically those with, money to spend. So media outlets might tailor their content to attract those more affluent demographics, sometimes at the expense of stories or perspectives that don't really fit that mold.
So, wow, the news we consume is being shaped by like who advertisers want to reach.
Yeah.
That's kind of unsettling.
It can be, and this kind of ties into the third filter, which is sources. Reporters, they can't be everywhere at once. They rely on sources for information, think experts, officials, people who are there.
Right. That makes sense, but how can that lead to bias? Like, aren't they just, getting the facts?
Well, the thing is, those sources often come from powerful institutions, right? So think government, corporations, these big organizations.
Right.
And media outlets, they depend on these institutions for, access, for information. And that can make them, well, a little hesitant to bite the hand that feeds them. You know what I mean?
So if like you're a journalist and your boss is like best friends with the CEO of some big company,
Yeah.
you might think twice before, writing that big expose, even if it's true.
Exactly, exactly. And that actually leads us to the fourth filter, which they call flack. Think of it like backlash.
Okay.
Angry letters,
Yeah.
boycotts, pressure campaigns from powerful groups, even lawsuits.
Okay, so flack is basically like when somebody tries to like shoot down a story they don't like.
Exactly, yeah. And they actually give the example of this group called Accuracy in Media, or AIM. It's a group that actively tries to influence media coverage. And they do that by, pressuring outlets to promote kind of certain viewpoints. It's a way to control the narrative by making it risky to deviate from it.
So if you're a media outlet and you're going to get slammed, like really slammed for covering a certain story a certain way, you might just be less likely to run it in the first place.
Exactly, exactly. Self-censorship, it's a powerful thing. And then that brings us to the fifth filter, which this one might sound a little outdated, but they argue it's still relevant. Anti-communism.
Wait, is this like a Cold War relic? Like, are we still worried about communists under our beds?
Well, it's not so much about, actual communists, but more about how certain ideologies can be used to kind of filter acceptable opinion.
Okay.
They highlight, for example, the use of former radicals as these as like experts.
Right.
So you have people who, once might have been critical of the government, and now they're given these platforms to denounce their old views.
So their past makes them seem more credible,
Exactly.
even if their current views are, I don't know, a little questionable.
Exactly. They fit a certain narrative, and they're given a platform, often without a whole lot of scrutiny of their actual claims.
Okay, so we've got these 5 filters, right?
Mhm.
We've got the profit-driven media, the advertising influence, the reliance on these powerful sources, the fear of flack, and then these kind of underlying ideological biases. It's a lot, but how does this actually play out in like specific cases?
That's where it gets really interesting. Let's look at how the media covers victims, specifically the idea of worthy versus unworthy victims.
Okay, before we get into that, can you define those terms for me?
Yeah.
What makes a victim worthy or unworthy in the eyes of the media?
So essentially, a worthy victim is someone whose suffering, evokes sympathy, it evokes outrage, often because they fit a narrative that aligns with kind of the dominant, power structure. Unworthy victims, on the other hand, are often ignored, or their suffering is, minimized. And often that's because they're seen as somehow deserving of their fate, or because their stories threaten to challenge those in power.
So it's not just about the tragedy itself, but about who the victim is and how their story fits into kind of these pre-existing narratives.
Exactly. They compare how the media covered 2 murders, a Polish priest during the Cold War, and then American churchwomen in El Salvador. Both tragic, but the media treatment was shockingly different. So the Polish priest, Jerzy Popieluszko, he was murdered in 1984. This was like the Cold War was still raging.
Right.
Poland was under communist rule, and the media coverage was, it was intense. Headlines everywhere about this, martyr for freedom.
Yeah, it was a huge international story. I remember hearing about it even as a kid.
Absolutely. And his funeral, it was this massive event. Hundreds of thousands of people, world leaders condemned the murder. The people who did it were put on trial. They were convicted. It really played into those Cold War anxieties.
Right, that whole like communist regime as the brutal oppressors,
Exactly.
and then the priest as this symbol of, resistance.
Exactly. Yeah. So a worthy victim because his story fit the narrative, the West versus the communist bloc.
Right.
Now, contrast that with the murders of 4 American churchwomen in El Salvador in 1980.
Well, this was during their civil war, right?
Yes, a brutal, brutal conflict. And the U.S. was backing the Salvadoran government against these leftist guerrillas. These women were nuns. They were living and working with the poor, and they were brutally murdered by government soldiers.
That's horrific, but I honestly don't remember hearing that much about it at the time.
And that's exactly the point. The media coverage was minimal, almost like muted. There was no global outcry, no massive funerals. You didn't have world leaders demanding justice. And when the story was covered, it was often framed in a way that kind of deflected blame from the US-backed government.
Wow, that's really chilling. So even though these women were brutally murdered, they were unworthy victims because their story didn't fit the narrative, or it actually kind of challenged U.S. policy in the region.
Precisely. Their deaths, they threatened to expose the brutality of a regime that the U.S. was supporting. So the media downplayed the story. And it's like this really stark example of how these filters can determine not just what we know, but how we feel about it,
Yeah. Okay, that's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
Let's maybe shift gears a little bit. Talk about another example. What are elections? Because we tend to think of elections as like these, symbols of democracy.
Right.
So how does the propaganda model apply there?
That's a great question. Because, Herman and Chomsky argue that the media often plays a role in legitimizing elections, even when those elections are, let's just say, deeply flawed or maybe even, outright rigged.
So you're saying that the media can be used to, like, prop up a dictator as long as they hold a sham election.
In a way, yeah, in a way. They give the example of elections in, like, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua during the Cold War. These were countries where the U.S. had a vested interest in seeing certain outcomes, right? Often, pro-U.S. regimes staying in power.
Right, and how did the media coverage play into that?
Well, they point out how the media often focused on, like, voter turnout. Record numbers of people turn out to vote.
Right.
Even if those elections were marked by, widespread intimidation or violence or fraud.
So focusing on the process rather than the outcome.
Exactly.
Creating this impression of a democratic process, even if the result is, already preordained.
Exactly. They also point out how the media often just kind of uncritically adopted the U.S. government's framing of those elections. So they just accepted their claims about the fairness of the process or the legitimacy of the results, even when there was evidence to the contrary.
It's like those elections become like a PR exercise then,
Yeah.
a way to create this illusion of democracy, but really maintain control.
Precisely. Yeah, precisely. And this ties back into those filters we talked about, right? The reliance on official sources, the fear of flack for, challenging the dominant narrative, the ideological bias that sees U.S. involvement as inherently beneficial.
Right, right. Okay, so we've seen how these filters can shape how we see victims, how we see elections. But what about something like war? Because that seems like it'd be harder to manipulate given, like, just how much attention it gets.
You would think so, right? But they actually argue that war is like a prime example of how this propaganda model works in practice, and they use the Vietnam War as kind of a case study.
Which makes sense because it was such a pivotal event and it really did kind of like expose the power of the media to shape public opinion.
Exactly. So initially, they point out how the media largely supported the U.S. war effort, framing it as this fight for freedom against communist aggression, really echoing the government's own rhetoric.
So the media was initially on board with the war.
Largely, yes. And they argue that this early coverage often relied very heavily on those official sources, government officials, military leaders, and it tended to downplay the brutality of the war, especially the civilian casualties.
But as the war went on, public opinion really started to turn against it. So did the media coverage change at all?
It did, but they argue that even as the media became more critical of the war, the range of acceptable dissent was still kind of surprisingly narrow.
Meaning?
Well, the debate was mostly about whether the war was winnable, not whether it was, justified in the first place. Like those underlying assumptions about the war, that the U.S. had a right to intervene in Vietnam, that it was, fighting for a noble cause, those were very rarely questioned in the mainstream media.
So it's like the media was still operating within a certain framework,
Yeah.
even as it became more critical of the kind of, the tactics being used.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And they point out how this limited framework was often reinforced by the media's reliance on experts. And often these were, former military officials or government insiders who were given these platforms to share their views, even if those views were, let's just say, self-serving or based on flawed assumptions.
So even as the public became more skeptical of the war, the media coverage was still being shaped by those filters, those hidden forces that were pushing a certain narrative.
Precisely. And they argue that this kind of selective reporting, this limited range of debate, had a profound impact on how the war was perceived and understood, even as it became, increasingly unpopular.
It's a good reminder that we always need to be like, critical consumers of news, but especially during times of war,
Absolutely.
when emotions are running high and, the stakes are so incredibly high.
Absolutely, yeah. It's crucial to remember that the media, even with the best of intentions, can be influenced by those filters, those hidden forces that shape what we see and hear and ultimately believe.
Right. It makes you wonder what other events, what other stories have been filtered through these lenses, right?
Right.
Shaping our understanding of the world without us even, like, realizing it.
And that's exactly what Herman and Chomsky are trying to get at. And they don't just offer critique, they offer a powerful challenge, which is how do we see through these filters? How do we become more conscious consumers of this information?
Right, because it's not enough to just, like, read the news. We have to read it with a critical eye
Exactly.
and be aware of those forces that might be shaping it.
Precisely. And it's not always easy, right? It takes effort, it takes awareness, but it's so important. And that's really what they're urging us to do.
It's easy to feel a little overwhelmed by all of this. Like, are we supposed to be, like, constantly on guard, scrutinizing every single thing we read and watch?
I mean, it's a fair point. We're dealing with, like, an overwhelming amount of information these days. It's not realistic to expect everyone to, like, analyze every headline and every tweet.
Right, it's exhausting just thinking about it.
Yeah.
So what can we do?
Well, I don't think it's about being, like, perfect news consumers. It's more about just being more aware, more deliberate about the information we're taking in. I like to think of it like we're swimming in this ocean of information, right?
Right.
And that ocean is full of currents that are trying to pull us in certain directions.
Mhm.
So it's about being aware of those currents.
Okay, so being aware of the currents is the first step. But how do we keep from getting, like, swept away?
Well, one thing they really emphasize is diversifying our media diets. You know, just like with food, if you're only eating one type of food all the time, you're probably missing out on some important nutrients.
Right.
Same goes for information.
So branch out.
Hmm.
But, like, where do you even start? There's so much out there.
It can be overwhelming. One thing you can do is be really intentional about where you're getting your news from. So instead of just passively scrolling through like your social media feeds, seek out those reputable news organizations. Look for places that have a good track record of accuracy and fairness.
Okay.
Those are good places to start.
But even within those organizations, those filters are still going to be at play, right?
They are. They absolutely are. But, you know, reputable outlets, they're more likely to at least have some systems in place to, like, try to guard against bias, you know? Like fact checking and things like that, editorial standards.
Right.
And they're more likely to have at least some diverse voices represented in their coverage.
Okay, so look for quality over quantity, but still be critical even of those sources.
Exactly, exactly. Don't just take anything you read or hear at face value. Question the sources that are being cited. Think about like who's being quoted and who might be left out of the story.
So it's about being an active participant in how we consume the news, not just a passive recipient.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Another strategy is to really actively seek out alternative perspectives. So if you find yourself always kind of gravitating towards news that confirms your existing views, make a conscious effort to like read something that challenges those views.
I'll admit that's not always easy. It's comfortable to kind of, stick with what we already think, right?
It is. But it's also kind of intellectually lazy.
True.
And exposing ourselves to these different perspectives is really how we develop critical thinking skills.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, exercising a muscle. The more we use it, the stronger it gets.
Right. That's a good analogy. And if we're not challenging ourselves to think critically, we're just more likely to get kind of like pulled along by those currents, by those filters,
Yeah.
right?
Precisely. Another really important thing that they talk about is that we have to be really wary of experts,
Yeah.
especially those who are presented as, you know, totally neutral and objective. Because in reality, they may have hidden agendas, they may have biases that are influencing what they're saying.
Right, because just because someone has a fancy title or they're like, on TV doesn't mean that they're automatically credible.
Exactly. Always ask yourself, okay, who is this expert?
Mhm.
What are their credentials? Who's funding their research? And what are their potential biases?
Right, so it's like doing a background check on the experts themselves before you just kind of like blindly accept what they're saying.
Exactly. And, you know, especially be wary of experts who have a history of making claims that turn out to be false or misleading. You know, there are some self-proclaimed experts out there who are much more interested in promoting themselves or their own agendas than in providing accurate information.
So it's not just being skeptical of the information itself, but also like the sources of that information.
Absolutely. And it's about kind of being aware of the power dynamics that are at play. Like who benefits from this particular narrative being pushed? Who's being silenced or marginalized? These are all like really important questions to ask yourself.
It's like they're giving us this whole new toolbox for navigating the world and the information that's out there.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And it's a toolkit that is more important now than ever before because we have this like, you know, just this constant fire hose of information coming at us.
Right, it's easy to feel powerless in the face of all of it, but you're right, they're giving us these tools to kind of like reclaim our agency, to become more critical thinkers and to, demand better from the media.
Exactly. And it's not just about us as individuals, right? We also need to be thinking about how we can help create a more informed and engaged public.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think we can start by having conversations like this one. You know, talking to our friends and families and communities about these issues, right? Sharing articles and books and documentaries that have challenged our own thinking. We can support organizations that are working to promote media literacy and critical thinking skills.
So create like a ripple effect, right?
Yeah.
Kind of spread the awareness and empower others to be more discerning about the information that's out there.
Yes, exactly. And it's about demanding better from our institutions, our schools, our libraries, our government. You know, we need to make sure that those institutions are providing the resources and the support that people need to be informed, engaged citizens.
That's a great point. it shouldn't be up to individuals to kind of like navigate this like complex information landscape alone, right? Like we need systemic solutions to address this systemic problem.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly. And those solutions need to be grounded in like a really deep understanding of how power operates, right? How it shapes the information that we consume, and ultimately how it influences our perceptions of the world around us.
Wow, this has been a real eye opener. It's a lot to take in, but it's also, like you said, it's empowering.
It is. It is. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by, the power of the media, but by understanding how these filters work, we can at least start to see through some of those manipulations and, like you said, reclaim our agency as informed citizens.
So it's not about giving up on the media entirely. It's about engaging with it more critically
Yeah.
and demanding better.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a more informed, a more engaged, and ultimately a more democratic society.
Well said. Thanks again for joining me for this deep dive. It's been a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure as well. And remember, everyone, keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
Always. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the heart of media bias. We hope that this deep dive has given you some new tools, some new perspectives for navigating the very complex world of information out there. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep those minds sharp.